In 2004, I presented a year-end project in film school to a pretty big audience. It wasn't quite this big. It was about 100 people, really big deal for me at the time. And there I was in the front row, and the auditorium's dark, film ends, the lights start going up, my palms are sweaty, I'm all nervous, my heart's beating, and it's my turn to jump on stage and take people's questions and comments. And I was so excited to hear what people had to say about this film, because I was so proud of what I had made. And before the lights could even finish going up, one of my classmates, his hand shoots up. And before I could even call on him, these words blurt out of his mouth. I will never forget them. They've been etched into my brain. "I can't believe you made us sit through that." It hurt. My film that I was so proud of, it was a failure. I failed to engage my audience. Somehow that year, I'd forgotten one of the foundational tenets of filmmaking. If you want to engage your audience, you have to have a story at your foundation. It's not about how gorgeous your film is, how meticulously it's edited, what great research you did. In this case, it was a documentary. How wonderfully composed, the lighting and the shots. None of that. I mean, that all matters. But ultimately, if you want to engage people at the foundation, you have to have an engaging story. Software, apps, services, digital, analog, websites, all of the above. I'm just going to call them products for short today. Products have a lot in common with film. If you want to engage your audience, you have to have a story at your foundation. Now, you can lay this story down by accident, like I had done on a lot of my most successful films up until that point in school. You can lay this story down by accident, like you are all undoubtedly doing on your most successful projects. Or you can lay this story down with meticulous care and intent, like I eventually learned to do, like this guy here. This is Vince Gilligan. He is the creator of the TV show Breaking Bad. And I heard what he's seated in front of is a story map for season 4 of Breaking Bad. And if you've I have not seen Breaking Bad, by the way, you need to go watch it. I like giving homework, so that'll be your first piece of homework today. And for the rest of you, what you can see here is what story does for screenwriters is this. Let me go back here. So you see the close-up of this card. This card is from near the end of season 4, as close to the end as you could get. What happens? If you've seen season 4, you might remember. If not, then just imagine what happens. But mapping the story helps screenwriters make things go boom. Possibly on screen, if that's part of your strategy, and absolutely for people on the other end. Now, in order to understand how this works, not just for movies, but for the things that we build, you first have to understand how it works for something like a movie. So I'm going to walk you through the kind of quick and dirty story 101 so you understand not just how a story works, but the mechanics of story, because this actually is very mechanical. So first, by the way, if any of you haven't seen Back to the Future, I'm going to have a couple of spoilers here, but luckily you can still go home and watch it as your second piece of homework, and you'll still have a blast. The only request I have is if any of you haven't seen it, which my unscientific survey says that there may be 3 of you in this audience who have not seen it, I just want you to tweet at me and let me know how it is while you're watching. For the rest of us, I'm going to bring you back to how the mechanics of story work with starting with the foundation. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And on that timeline, we have a structure. We call this the narrative arc. On that arc, we have plot points. Now, here's how they function. So in Back to the Future, the beginning of the story, we call this the exposition. It's a fancy way of saying the beginning. We're introduced to Marty, and he's got a friend, Doc, and they have a time machine, and things are pretty cool. At the beginning of every story, you're introduced to a hero and they have some kind of a big goal, something they want to do, something they want to accomplish. In this case, he wants things like a truck and go on vacation with his girlfriend, but there's something bigger there. There's something about him wanting to do cool things, make something of himself. So at the beginning of the story, things are pretty cool, so that very quickly something can change or go wrong. Something happens. We often call this an inciting incident, or sometimes we just call it the problem. Something arises that catapults a hero onto a journey. And sometimes we call it the call to action too. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But in Back to the Future, what happens is Doc is shot, and then Marty has to figure out how to get out of the situation, and he jumps in a time machine, and bam, he's now back in the past. This leads to what we call rising action. It's called that because if the x-axis is time, essentially, the y-axis here, you can think of it as interestingness or intrigue. It's exciting, things get really exciting, and then they calm down. It's not good or bad, because then our diagram would look like a crazy heartbeat. But in this diagram, it's just things get exciting, and at the end of the movie, at the end of the story, things are gonna calm down. So what happens here? Well, he's on a journey now to solve the problem. He's going to spend most of the rest of the movie trying to solve this problem. He's back in time. He's got to get back to the future. Along the way, he meets his mom. His mom has a crush on him. Things get weirder and weirder. And in the audience, we're hooked. We're engaged. We want to know how this story is going to end up. So great, most of the movie is, it's almost over. You're almost near the end, and he's starting to figure out how to get back home, how to power the time machine. He could get home, but now, near the end of the story, we're at this moment that we call the moment of crisis. This is the point of no return. This is that moment in every story where there's a big bad that makes us wonder, the hero is in peril. Will they or won't they overcome this very last hurdle and solve their problem? So in this case, Marty's on stage. He's starting to disappear. Like, he's trying to play Johnny Be Good, and things are really, really bad. His parents, they haven't kissed, and if they don't, then he'll never have been born. And by the way, he still hasn't figured out really how to power the time machine. And so we're on the edge of our seats. And what scientists tell us is that our palms are sweaty and our pulse quickens. When we're in an audience watching a hero on screen, we identify with them, and it's as if we are on screen with them. So if the story ended here, it would be a tragedy, and he could just disappear, and then the credits would roll, and that would be really sad. Luckily, this is more of a happy path type of story. So how does he overcome it? Well, his parents kiss. He's finally born. He can finish playing Johnny Be Good, and hey, and then there's lightning, and they can figure out how to power the time machine, and all is almost good in the world. This is called the climax or the resolution. This is the point in the story where the hero solves their problem, that problem that arose early on. It's called the climax because it is the highest point in the arc. This is the point where you have lightning and sword fights and really exciting things. Now, the story could end right here. And credits could roll, but what scientists now tell us about this, there's actually a lot of science, I can talk more about it later, but what scientists tell us is that we would be very unsettled if the credits just rolled right now, and yay, he powered the time machine, and the end. What we need is closure. So how do you get that? Well, we call this falling action. It's called falling because now you're going down the arc and you're just calming down. This is when our pulse starts to go back to normal, and we come back to life, we can start breathing normally again. It's sometimes called denouement, which is a fancy French word for literally unknotting or unraveling. And now at the end of the story, just like with most adventure tales, Marty is back home. Only Marty is better than when the story started. He's learned something, he's grown. And often home is a little bit better than when the story started as well. In this case, his parents are really cool. They're published authors, and Biff is their manservant, and he's got keys to the truck that Marty always wanted. Cool, he got the truck, and yeah, he got his girlfriend's there, and they embrace. And if this is a typical Hollywood movie, the credits would roll, and the end, and fade to black, and all would be good in the world. But wait, there's more. So at the very end, Doc shows up in a flying time machine now, and he runs up to Marty and his girlfriend and it says, Marty, Marty, come with me. Where? To the future. And then we have a big to be continued. And if any of you were a kid in the 80s like I was and you had to wait years for the sequel and you're just dying for it to come out. But so this is how you transform what is a one-off narrative fully enclosed into what we call a serial narrative. It's stories that keep going over time. And each installment should get better and better than the last, except for Back to the Future 3. But I like to pretend that one didn't exist. So this is how story works for something like a movie. Most of us are not making movies on a daily basis. So how does this apply to the work that we do? Well, I want you to look at this photograph of these two people. If I were to tell you that they're using an app that comes pre-installed on every iPhone, I want you to just yell it out. What app are they using? FaceTime. So what's going on there? How do you know that? It took you all split seconds to compute it. Some of you, I have that photo in my book. Some of you might have read my book, but most of you took split seconds to compute that photograph. How? So what you see is a photo of two people. They're a little bit older. Maybe they're grandparents. Maybe they have grandkids. Maybe they want to see their grandkids. They don't live near them. And they're probably having a video call with their grandkids. Look, they're so happy. They're smiling. What scientists tell us is that the same narrative, the technical term is narrative parsing. The same narrative parsing we use to understand meaning from a 2-hour-long TV show or a 5-year-long, 2-hour-long movie or a 5-year-long TV show is the same narrative computing that our brain uses to understand meaning from a photograph. And it just took you all split seconds to put that story together and to understand what you're looking at. Now, what scientists also tell us, however, on the flip side, is that if you were one of those two grandparents thinking about using FaceTime as a product, or actually using FaceTime over any period of time, if you are one of those two people, life is a story. And in that story, what is key, this is what your brain is always searching for, you are the hero. We all want to be heroes in our own lives, in our own stories. And so from today on out, I want you to start thinking of yourselves not as designers, developers, product managers, project managers, executives, the list goes on and on. I want you to start thinking of yourselves as people who are building a story for anyone on the other end of what you are creating for them. Your customers, people internally, on your team, on your business, anyone who's going to come into contact with the things that you build, they need to be heroes in the story of how they're going to engage with the things you put in front of them. So I'm going to show you how story functions in something like a product. And I'm going to start at the highest level first because I want you to see how story governs how we get excited about things. I also want to I'm going to use the first iPhone as an example because we're all familiar with the iPhone. You all either own an iPhone or you own a phone that was originally modeled after the iPhone. And so it's, no. That's very different now, I swear. I know. And it has a very different story now. I'm talking about Android, not Windows Phone. There was a while ago where many of us would have had Windows phones. So this is a familiar device. So it's often, when I'm trying to remember, how does story work again, often I just go back to the iPhone as shorthand. So what are the mechanics of the iPhone? Well, if you think back to 10 years ago, the story could have been something like this, which is you might have been someone who listened to music on the go and you made phone calls on the go. And things were pretty cool. Life was really good 10 years ago. You had, it was easier than ever to do this kind of stuff. You might have had an iPod and, a cool Nokia brick phone that played Snake, my favorite game. And so things were really good. What was the problem? Well, it sucked to carry two devices. It wasn't ideal. So what a lot of us wanted, super nerds, we wanted this thing. We just called it the iPhone. We wanted Apple to build it. It was going to be a smartphone, a two-in-one device. And if you start building the story this way, what you start noticing is that this is a little too good to be true, because there's no tension there. There's no crisis. And tension is really important to stories working and being as successful and as structurally sound as they can be. So what could get in the way of you adopting a device like this? Well, a bunch of reasons. You might have owned an iPod, and it was very expensive, but also you love your iPod. You might own a mobile phone. You love your phone. Why do you want a new device? It might have been a usability issue, which is smartphones at the time were impossible to use. And if you were super nerdy like I was, and you had your Palm Trio with Bookworm and all these cool games and stuff with your stylus, nerds were okay with smartphones, but most people were not. They were a tiny sliver of the market. And so you just, the usability issue is strong when you're going to be spending a ton of money on this thing and thinking, oh, it's too difficult to use, no thanks. And the cost, again, is really expensive. Smartphones were expensive, and this iPhone was going to be expensive too. So in the end, if you think about it, how much do you really want this device? How compelling is that promise of listening to music and making phone calls on the go? So if you look at this story from a structural perspective, what you actually see going on here is that this is what we call, again, a very technical term here. I'm all technical today. So this is what we call anticlimactic. Literally, there is no climax. It's a problem and a solution, and that's linear. That's just a straight line. So the story here actually isn't very compelling. Now, you can use a story as a really lightweight prototype, and we're talking a bit about prototypes today. So you could see this, but maybe you're not quite convinced, and you think, all right, let's actually sketch it out, because I really still think there's something to this. So you could do that. This is what we have in the US Patent Archives. This is something that Apple submitted the year before the iPhone came out. It's an iPod that makes phone calls, essentially. And if you remember the touch wheel, so the way that you input numbers, and then get the right number, and letters, so the English language are easy, because only 26 letters. Go back. This device would have been more difficult to use than an iPod, which is unfortunate. Even more unfortunate is that this device would have been more difficult to use than a rotary phone. And that's not okay when we're developing new products. And so, or developing any kind of products, quite honestly. So another way to look at that architecturally is that's what we call, you could look at it as a cliffhanger, which is I'm going on a journey and oh, that's not really delivering, or a tragedy, and that's really sad. So again, luckily in our world, we're not in the business of building tragedies. We are concerned with how to get the story to be complete, get people over any potential things that might get in the way. So what is the story of what the iPhone ultimately became? Well, if you look at the iPhone as a story, as something that embodies a story, what you see is that this starts off it's not very good. In other words, you got to think big when you're developing stories. You have to get as deep and high level as you can, which is you want to listen to music, you want to make phone calls on the go. Why? And when you dig down deep enough, what you see is that it's really a story of communication. You want to communicate with the world around you. Well, great. 10 years ago, it was easier than ever to communicate with the world around you. So what was the problem? Well, the way Steve Jobs positioned it, because this is the story of what the iPhone eventually became. It's also the story that he wove through his keynote presentation when he unveiled the iPhone to the world. So what you see here is you can use stories in a lot of different ways in your work. But so what's the problem? Easier than ever to communicate. Well, the way that he positioned it was the problem is that smartphones suck. So this is what Steve Jobs is saying 10 years ago. He's talking about how smartphones it's easier than ever to communicate, and then smartphones suck. But the thing is, again, remember I told you 10 years ago smartphones were a tiny sliver of the market. Nobody wanted them. So you have a little bit of dissonance going on here. And then he goes on to tell you that, hey, I have a smartphone for you. It's called the iPhone. And what you see here is some tension building. And again, that's okay, because tension is what grabs the human brain. Again, I'll talk more about the brain later. But okay, so you don't want a smartphone here. I have a smartphone for you. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of tension now. I don't want a smartphone. It's going to be difficult to use. I own an iPod. I own a mobile phone. Why would I want this thing? So what did Apple ultimately build? Well, what we've got is what they positioned as the best way to communicate. It's a device that would work like magic. And it wasn't a 2-in-1 device like people wanted. It was a 3-in-1 device. It was a phone, it was an iPod, and then it was this third thing that nobody asked for, what they called jokingly an internet communicator, which, by the way, came from Star Trek. If you're ever working on cool, shiny stuff like this, which I know we're not all like building iPhones all the time, but just go to sci-fi movies and reverse engineer the narrative arcs of their props, and you've got really cool stuff going on. So it did this third thing, an internet communicator. You could access the world at your fingertips. And so what we have here is a story now with structure. And it also has an ending. Because if you were a super fan, you might have run out and bought the first iPhone right away. You camped out in front of the Apple Store, but you would have bought that other device too. You don't even matter. What the rest of us here, you might have bought a second generation, probably more likely third and onwards. Eventually, people wanted a device like this. We have a story that is more complete. Even those two grandparents in that photograph want this thing now. For them, it might have taken 10 years for that journey to happen, and that's okay, because what happens here is when you think like a storyteller and think more importantly like a story builder, you start bringing in what users need to do and what the business needs to do into the picture, because that end goal and that following action, it's not just about your customers, your users. Yes, they matter. It's also your business. Is your business in the business of helping people communicate? Great. Then the story can move forward. Not only that, how are you going to start measuring the success of this story? And this is what you start thinking of in terms of, I'll talk a little bit more about metrics and analytics in a little bit, but these stories are something that tie users and the business together. And so to reverse engineer this high-level story of how we think about products, you always want to ask first, who is your user and what is their big goal? Then what is the problem? Why can't they currently meet their goal without your product? Then what is your product name? And what is the market category? And this is just simple, like just plug and play at this point. This is almost like Mad Libs. So then you have to ask, what is the competition? Why might they not want to adopt your product or think that it's a good idea? And these could be mental hurdles or it could be actual competitors. How do you overcome that? Well, ultimately you have to promise some kind of value. So this is your value proposition. And you have to provide some kind of competitive advantage. There's got to be a reason why I think this is going to be better than what else is out there. And how does the story end? Well, you just want to ask yourself, what is the takeaway that we want people to think or feel when they're thinking about our product? And ultimately, what is their big goal? Again, you just need to bookend it and make sure that they have the promise of their goal being met if they adopt your product or if they use it. And this is when you start bringing the business in again and think in terms of, okay, do we want people to buy it, try it, use it? What action eventually do we want people to take? Because that action is going to now start dictating the rest of your product strategy, which is the story now has to be echoed into every experience that people have with your product, because otherwise you're just selling things that don't deliver. So if it's the iPhone, you think about unboxing as a story, that has to have this same narrative arc, this same arc of magic and communication. And that's something that Apple focuses on a lot. They have a whole lab that's focused on unboxing, and there's a whole genre of YouTube about unboxing. Like, people really get excited about this unboxing stuff. So that's one part of where story then needs to be echoed and experienced. And then it even goes down to something as I don't want to say seemingly insignificant, because we all wouldn't be here today, but as tiny and microscopic as the UI and UI decisions. So I want to show you how story works in something more mundane, more like the stuff that we work on every day, because we're not all designing shiny iPhones all the time. And so I want to show you how story works in something as simple as a web flow. So this is a flow that Twitter came up with several years ago. When they were having an issue, they were growing, and people were signing up to use Twitter. People were really excited about this Twitter thing. But what was happening is that people would sign up to use Twitter, and they weren't returning. Maybe they'd come back a day later, a couple days later. A month later, they definitely were not returning. And so Twitter had an engagement problem. And what they wanted to figure out is, was there a way, the first time someone used Twitter, was there a way that they could experience the value in using Twitter so that they'd be more likely to return over time? And what they came up with was a flow that functioned like a story. And I won't leave you hanging, by the way. This worked, and it was so successful that they ended up having to keep this live for years. I'm sure it drove people nuts that they couldn't change the onboarding flow, but hundreds of millions of people not just signed up for Twitter using this flow, but signed up and became engaged, active users using it. So here's how this works, which is at the beginning of the story, you are someone who wants to be in the know. And they spell it out for you. So this is where you start bringing things like content into the picture, and messaging, and voice and tone, which is, hey, just welcome to Twitter, start a conversation, be in the know. So they just tell you what your goal is going to be. But they do this because they have a hunch of why you're there. And this is why research is important. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So great, cool. I want to be in the know. What's the problem, or what do I need to do? And so the inciting incident here, it's a big yellow button. We call this the call to action often, and it's because, again, this is the thing that's going to kickstart you on that journey, which is, if you want to be in the know, you have to sign up for Twitter. If you don't press that yellow button, then you just need to go home. So again, this is where metrics come into play, because if people did not move past this screen, then Twitter would have had to reevaluate and not have the flow work like this. But in this case, this calls you to action. So, all right, sign me up. So now you start going through a flow, and you've got a series of steps, a series of screens. So first you're introduced to a timeline, and you're introduced to a tweet, and then you learn about the idea that if you follow people, you get more tweets. So I follow people, I get tweets, and then I keep following people, and I get tweets. And this happens for a series of steps, and you could get to the point where you're thinking, why am I doing this again? What is Twitter? Why would I continue onward following famous people? I'm not really sure what the point of this is. You could drop off, but if you just go on to the next step, you get something else. And again, this is where metrics matter. If you find in your analytics that people are dropping off, then you need to tweak. But in this case, people continue to the next step. And what we have here is an unlikely climax. It looks just like all the other previous screens, but at this point in the flow, you're almost done. What you have now is an invitation to authenticate and add your friends, add your contacts, add your friends, family, coworkers, people that you know. Now, the reason why this is the high point is that is by definition what a social network is. At least a few years ago, that was what Twitter is. The story of a business evolves over time as well, but Twitter was being in the know, not just with famous people, but with your friends, family, everybody who matters. So, okay, I see what Twitter is. What, again, their analytics told them is people moved on, authenticated to the next step. Then you've got the opportunity to add your bio or add a photo. But at this point, we're in the following action. This doesn't even matter. You could just skip it, or you could do it. It's insignificant as long as you just click once more, and now as quickly as possible, just like a filmmaker would do. The idea is wrap it up as quickly as possible. Now you're at the end of your story. You're home. We call this in our world logged in home. Now, what you have is a story-driven context of why logged out home looks different than logged in home, right? So logged out home is often unpopulated and it's got more introductory material, and then logged in home is better than when the story started. You've learned something, you've grown, you've gone on a journey, and now you have something to show for it. You can see the progress that you've made. So we have a rule of thumb also, which is never leave people on an empty state. And again, you have that context here of why we don't do that. You need to complete the story. In the olden days, we would have just dropped people on a thank you page and said, thank you, bye-bye, come again, see you later. And in the late 90s, we would have given them an animated GIF too. It would have been so cool. But we have to do a little bit more now that people are expecting more if they're actually going to be using our stuff over time. So this is a flow that takes place over a period of maybe a few minutes. I'm going to walk you through one that takes place over just a few seconds. This is a flow from an app called Fantastical. And what you're doing here, this is the key task of the application. You're adding an event. Their story is that they help you manage your life on the go. It's an iOS calendaring app. And so, okay, the beginning of the story, cool, I need to add something to my calendar, I need to stay organized, call to action, just a simple plus button, okay, go to add an event. Then I start typing. So for the rising action, what we have here as you start typing is the interface starts acting intuitive and starts doing things for you. So I start typing lunch, and then what happens is it assumes lunch is going to be at noon. And if not, I can change that, or I could just leave it as is. If I say lunch with Elon tomorrow, then it assumes today is Thursday, tomorrow's Friday. It adds the date in, so we have visual feedback on many levels with text, and then that bar right there. And so then I'm typing Palo Alto, so we start having animated text that goes from Palo Alto, and then it shows up on my bar. It assumes that is where lunch is going to be. And great, so I'm almost done. This is just a few seconds again. Then what? Well, I need to commit. So I hit done, and this could be a moment of crisis. If you were using the iOS default calendaring app like me, you probably entered your data incorrectly. You probably got something wrong, the date, you selected something wrong in the picker, and then your calendar event slides down after you commit, and then it goes away, and now you're back on home, but home looks exactly like when you started, and you added the date to the wrong date, and you're screwed when lunch happens in a few weeks, or it doesn't happen. But in this case, what happens when you commit, the way they get you over that potential hurdle is there's an animation. So I know an animation is something we're thinking a lot about as well. Now you see how animation supports a story. And that's something that filmmakers have known for years. Disney was one of the first people to really explore this idea that animation moves a story forward, or you just don't do it because it's really difficult to do. But so what animation does here is it gives you the fancy word, system feedback and affordances of just knowing that something went the way that we wanted it to go. So the event folds up on itself, and then it shrinks up onto the correct date, and then it bursts red, and it fades back out to white, and great, we are back home. The end. Home is better than when we started. I'm better. I've learned something, I've grown, and I'm going to make lunch when it happens in a few weeks. So again, it's tiny, simple flow, but why it matters is because you could be wondering, well, iOS, their default calendaring app doesn't do fancy stuff like that, and they're Apple, right? Why should I do that, on my next project? And the thing about this is Fantastical, this is the core of their business. You pay to download this app. The company behind it, they develop apps like this that you pay to use. And so it has to have a value proposition that you then experience each and every time you use the app. If the iOS calendaring app was why you bought an iPhone or an iPad, then that app would have to do this kind of stuff as well. But none of us go out and buy an iPhone or an iPad because, oh my God, that calendaring app is so incredible. All the things I can do with that calendaring app. However, FaceTime is another story there is a compelling story there on many, many levels. And your grandparents, your in-laws, they're buying iOS devices because of what they can do with the device. So again, if it's core to your business, having a story echoed in the key flows and interactions that people have with your products is really important to help people stay engaged over time and experience value in using products. Again, there's tons of science. I will talk a bit about that. But first I want to walk you through something that this was a few seconds long. This is a flow that might be a few weeks long, because these can stretch out and have different episodes and be sliced and diced in different ways. So this is Happy Socks. They're a sock company, and their story is just they make your feet happy. It's a simple story, not much to it, but it's a compelling one. And so you might get an email on your phone and saying, hey, there's a sale, you want to buy some socks? And you might think, oh, I really shouldn't buy another pair of socks. No, thanks. And then a week later, you're on your desktop at work, and you click on that email again, and you think, okay, maybe I'll go see what socks they have. It can't hurt. And so you click through, and then you see a pair of socks that hey, those are kind of nice. Oh, I really shouldn't buy them. Oh, but they're really nice. But I really don't need another pair of socks. Well, but look at the socks. So if you get over this hurdle, then what you've got here is another instance where animation moves the story forward. And what we've got here is that your little product box, it animates, and then it sort of zooms in onto the cart. And it's a simple animation, a simple flourish. And I know a lot of us talk about delight often, but what you see here is the context of something like delight. I know, and Daniel talked about that earlier with the robot, like you have context for delight. It's not just delight for delight's sake. Suddenly, I'm okay with the fact that I just added those socks to my cart, because I remember that, this is about sock foot happiness. Okay, nice, happy animation. Cool. So this one episode can be sliced and diced this way, where you see different key points of where things matter. And again, if you think about that timeline, that climax really just needs to be nearest towards the end of any flow. Again, I'll talk about the science of that for sure in a bit. But so you can slice and dice it a little bit longer, which is, okay, I purchased my socks, and what has to happen? What is the end of the story in that scenario? Well, so it seems very unexciting, but you get your confirmation email. That is what is going to have to be the most exciting part of the slightly longer episode. And so what we have here, how Fantastical continues to support the story. It's not the most gorgeous email in the world, but they do it through text, through copy, through tone and voice. So it's just, hey, the Happy Crew welcomes you, and they have exclamation points, which in this case is totally fine. I'm happy that I bought my Happy Socks. And so I know it's going to come in a couple weeks. Cool. To be continued. So a couple weeks later, then the story continues, and suddenly we're not on a computer anymore. And it's, you might be panicking in your seats thinking, oh, but like, I build the website, and I have no control after this point. Well, yes and no. This is when you start thinking like a story builder at your organization, and you start making friends with everybody who you can take out to coffee at your company, everyone from all the different touch points of a user's journey, because you're all creating the story together. And so, or I'll talk about how you might do this at work, but workshops, I know Daniel talked about that earlier, bring everyone in and help them co-create it with you. So here, what happens after this episode? Well, you have to get your socks. So what we have now is a new high point, which is you got like a really nice package. Oh, it's green and polka dots, and that's exciting. People get really excited about this at this point, and they take to YouTube and they record themselves unboxing Happy Socks. So this is a subgenre of the unboxing genre on YouTube. If you ever want to have some fun, just like Google. It's kind of amazing. But this is someone who is so excited about his socks, and oh, they gave me a card. And this other person, oh my God, my card, I love my card. And now you see context of why sometimes you get a little gift with something, with a purchase, or at a party that you went to. This is something that, it delights us. And again, delight is okay for this story. This person here, he gets a pin, and he's so excited. And his video is 10 minutes long. I wish I could show it to you, but I can't. It's really long. But he takes his pin out of the box. I'm just going to act it out for you. And he, like Golem in Lord of the Rings, he starts stroking it. And wow, this is great. And he's so excited. So again, people get really excited about this stuff. But if you think about it, ultimately, what has to be the high point, the climactic moment of your journey with a pair of happy socks? And you don't have to yell this out, but you can just think about it in your heads, which is, and you're correct, which is ultimately it has to be the socks. Feeling the socks, so he pulls them out again like Golem. Ooh, precious, and they're really soft, and ultimately you have to put them on. They have to feel good, and it works. I'm wearing a pair right now. I don't work for them at all. I make no money off of this, but they're really nice socks, and they're fun. I feel fun when I'm wearing them. So you see how story can stretch out a little farther here. This might be a period of several weeks and different touch points, some on web, some on not, but it is the whole story that people are going to experience. You can have story happen really fast with a tiny conversation with a bot. So this is one screen. We don't even have multiple screens here. This is when you sign up for Slack and you interface with the bot, and it teaches you a couple of things. You can imagine the story arc. We'll just make it vertical here, and it's like that. And at the bottom, oh, there's a moment of delight. Oh, that was cool. The robot helped me do something, and all I had to do is just type a few words. Cool. It was easy, and that's the value proposition that Slack is trying to get you to experience. So this is something that lasts just a period of, maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute, one screen. You can have stories be really, really, really short as well. No matter how you look at it, you reverse engineer them. So I'm going to show you how this works mechanically. You always need to ask, who is your hero, and what is their big goal? Then, what is their problem, incentive, or call to action that's going to move them forward? Then there's going to be a flow, and the question is just, what happens next? First, next, then, after that, after that. And by the way, for those of you, I know you've got slides, and I've also have downloads and worksheets on my website as well, so all this you can access afterwards, but if you do want to take pictures or anything, it's totally, totally cool. So you've got a series of steps. Again, each one has to just get better than the last. And then always know that there's going to be some kind of impediment, something that might get in the way of someone moving forward to the end of this flow. You don't want it to get in the way, but you just want to embrace that this kind of thing might be in someone's head and that you want to help them move forward. So what kind of impediments might get in the way at this point? Well, you might require some kind of sign up at this point in the flow. You might require payment or someone's credit card information, or there might be just funnel drop-off that you see in your metrics or analytics and you don't know why people are having some kind of impediment. There might be mental hurdles. People might be bored, lacking value, having usability issues. These are things you can look at in your quantitative metrics or qualitative. I know we're talking a lot about research and getting things out in front of people. You can just watch people, observe, and see what issues they're having. You want to get them over this hurdle, and you do so by helping them, by building something that helps them solve the problem that they have, and that helps them experience the value that using your product promises. Then just finish, wrap it up. Think again like a filmmaker, wrap it up as quickly as possible, and the end. Their goal has to be met at the end of this flow, or if it's something where the goal can't just be met in this one session, the promise of the goal has to be met, and you need to remind them that if they keep engaging with something, keep coming back, keep using it, that they will meet their goal over time. What matters again here is that this goal is 100% measurable. This is something that you can get data on to make sure people are successfully doing. And I'll talk a little about that in a bit. But what matters here, again, is that you think of any kind of journey that people have with your product as a story. It could be something that's a few seconds. It could be something that's a few weeks long. And it can be even long-term engagement that is governed with story. It could be over a period of years, because this is how the brain works. Again, this idea here is engagement. If you want to engage your audience, you have to have a story at your foundation. Now, why story? Because I could be here talking to you today about game design, let's say. Yeah, if you design everything like a game, you'll engage your audience. And the thing is, there's a lot of truth to that. You will. But what game designers know, the most successful ones, actually every game designer knows this, is that if you want to engage people with your game, you have to have a story at your foundation. And that story has a certain kind of architecture. So a lot of disciplines, even film, took story from other disciplines like theater and fireside chats. The scientists that have been looking at this, what they think is going on here is that story is one of the oldest ways that humans have to communicate with the world around us. Communication happens two ways. It's outward and inward, understanding things as well. And so the idea is that if you were in cave people times and you wanted to tell Timmy not to go down to the river alone, you could just tell Timmy, don't go down to the river alone, and they're not going to listen to you, and they're going to go down to the river alone. Or you could tell Timmy a story about the time that Lucy went down to the river alone, and this happened, and then this happened, and then now the story sticks. So there's some evolution to this. And the reason why story sticks so much is that the best that scientists can figure out, I just want you to take a second to let this sink in, which is there's no such thing as an actual experience. We have moments in time, and time is fleeting. So that moment from a moment ago, it's gone, and now I'm in a new moment, but now that's already gone, and now I'm going to jump around a lot, and I'm in a new moment. And it's hard to keep up. If our brains had to actually process that time doesn't exist and we're only ever in one moment, we would go crazy. There's an actual debilitating called a disease, neurological disease called dysnarrativia, where you can't process narrative, and it's like amnesia, like you actually can't function. And so our brains need something to make sense of all this insanity. And what story does is it gives us structure to make sense of things that happen to us in time, so that we remembered what happened. We remember we know what's going on in the moment based on what happened, and we know what's going on in the moment based on what we project to happen if we move forward and take some kind of action. What scientists tell us is that when our brain experiences something that is structured like a story, our brains are activated. And we're more likely to see the utility in using something. So it'll seem useful to us because we can project a story of what we can do with this thing. We're more likely to experience something being usable. And by that I mean there's this concept called the peak-end rule, which is we remember the highs of an experience, we remember the lows of an experience, and we remember what came nearest towards the end of an experience, which is exactly a story arc structure. And so if high points, if value is delivered nearest towards the end of a flow, we often let things slide. And we often are okay with, I know Luke talked about this yesterday, this idea of change, right? It's not that, like if people love what they're doing and get something out of it, we let things slip. I've worked with so many businesses that have some quirks that are going on early in a flow or early in an experience, but people still love the product and they'll let anything slide. The story is intact. So what we've got here going on also is when you've got these story-like experiences, you're more likely to want to take action and do things. So it might be you can see what you can do with something and I'm going to take action, and it affects desirability. And so also value. You not only experience value, but you remember experiencing value, because what came nearest towards the end, again, is just what we remember. And all of this, you can fold it up and see how this affects choice. So the better the experience, the better the story with something is, the more I'm going to want to choose to experience it over and over and over again, and the more I'm going to want to choose to recommend it to others. And if you can imagine, once a story is sound, recommendation and word of mouth, that becomes easy because the story was written for me by people who built the product. All I need to do is just go tell people, oh my God, you gotta download this thing, or you gotta go do this thing, use this app, buy this phone, it's awesome, I promise. So this is how story works, why it helps our brains make sense of the world around us. But how do you go do this on your next project? Well, this is when you start thinking like a filmmaker again. And you could hire me to go find the story for you, and I'll create a very fancy PowerPoint presentation and everyone will love it. But honestly, I don't do that. I mean, you can, but I don't want to do that for you. You could learn how to be storytellers yourselves. You could also empower, I'll show you in a second, an instance where that works. Empower others. Think in terms of bringing people in on your organization to build the story with you so that buy-in happens better because they feel like they understood it. So how you do this, again, is thinking like a screenwriter. And you go big. Remember Vince Gilligan on that wall, he had cards. Stories at their best are collaborated on, are co-created on a wall with cards. If you can't get together with your team, if you're not co-located, you can do this. Imagine that as a spreadsheet. You would just imagine the narrative arc on top of your spreadsheet, but you can do it with spreadsheets. You can do this with other collaborative tools out there. There are a ton of different ways. In my book, I mentioned a bunch of different ways you would do this, but the idea is, first, you are a story sleuth. You go out, and your job is to find the story. And so you go out and talk to people. I know that's something else we're talking about here a lot today. If you have the time and the buy-in, you could do a real fancy study with a lot of users. Otherwise, like you learned about today, you can just talk to a few people. I would say, at least 5, just get out of the building. Let's say you just talk to 3 people. What you've got here is 3 stories. You map them out. Once you map them out, you start seeing what the story is, what it could be. And this is either people who are already using your product, who are already doing something, existing customers, or new potential customers who aren't using your product yet. There's a story there. So first you find your story. If for some reason you really don't have time to go out and talk to people, and it happens, and that's okay, you could just make it up. So in this case, what you do is you get your core team and get any key stakeholders. Again, if I know Daniel talked about this, if you can bring the CEO in on a story mapping session, it's kind of amazing because they feel ownership over the project that you're going to ultimately work on. But see, you can make up the story and just imagine, all right, what might the story be? And suddenly, a story drives your hypothesis and the things that you're going to build. And so stories can be really, really lightweight prototypes in essence. This is something I worked on recently with a startup where they really weren't sure what their story was. They were pitching, they were getting investors on board, and they were trying to and not really sure what was going on. And so we just mapped out a simple story of what we thought was going on. And then once we had this on paper, we were able to have the team go out and start validating it. So their next homework was going out and talking to potential customers and finding out, is this really the story or is it not? So stories can be really lightweight. You can also, once you've got your story, you can test it, you can start developing it further with your team. So on this project, I was working with a nonprofit where, in this case, they really wanted us to go out and find the story for them. They wanted to figure out a digital strategy. They were going to redesign their website and their mobile app, but they wanted to know how to build everything so that it was geared towards getting people to donate more money to the nonprofit, which is really important to their bottom line. And so they wanted to find out, well, what's the story why do people give us money? They thought they knew, but they weren't really quite sure. And so what we had was a series of stories that we found. Now, I could come back to this organization and again have that fancy PowerPoint and shake hands and leave and everyone's happy. But I found that it's not satisfying when you want to actually get things built. And so what I'll typically do more in this case, and this is something that you can and should be doing with your work, is let's say you've gone out and done your own research with your team, you know what the stories are. Bring it back to everyone, and now you start working together to figure out, just like screenwriters, what are all the things that can now go in the story to support the story, to move it forward. And you start getting technical. It might be features, functionality, what are all the, does it happen on the mobile app here? And you start thinking of the journey as a big story. You're not going to uncover every single specific requirement this way. What you're looking for is engagement. How are people ultimately going to be engaged doing this certain thing, and what do we need to build to make that happen? What thinking this way helps you do is assess strengths, weaknesses, opportunities in a visual manner that you wouldn't have otherwise seen if you just jumped right into prototyping or using pixels, because you can visually see, hey, there's this part that we haven't fleshed out, or there is just a question that we have, a giant cliffhanger, and let's figure that out first. And then you could the next day start jumping into prototyping, of course. So this shouldn't be like a big, long process that you're doing. This could just take a couple hours. You can get more technical if you're on an engineering team or you want to bring your engineers in, and you can start thinking, okay, now we have requirements, front end, back end, is this difficult? You can start talking about level of effort and scope of work and what you're going to be doing. Once you've got an idea of what your story is, you can then also start prototyping it. Lightweight. So again, this is all stuff that you're learning about today, which is you could do sketches, you could draw comics, you can sketch user interfaces, do paper prototypes. The idea here is that you're not just prototyping for functionality, but you're prototyping that story. And so if you're sketching it out on paper, the key is having all those plot points reflected in one of these boxes. And that's how you see if the story is intact or not. Once you've got that visualized, you can start folding it into an actual prototype, a paper prototype, or something digital. And in this case, what we had is I was working with a startup several years ago where they did not want to redesign their core product. But for good reason, no one wants to redesign. It's scary. And what we realized is that the story that customers could have was not the story that customers were having, and that if they didn't fix this, the company was going to go out of business. And so we tried to convince the executive team that, hey, we need to rebuild this whole thing from scratch. And the thing about that is, no CEO wants to say, oh yeah, okay, let's spend millions of dollars rebuilding this whole thing. That sounds like a great idea. It's risky. It's insane. And so in this case, what we did was we started actually being meticulous about mapping out our story and stories of what the product could be. And we started bringing people in from across the company to co-develop it with us, and started telling it. And we started getting a little more buy-in from telling, but ultimately we had to show. And so brought this prototype. It was something that I had my lead designer and lead engineer. I'd lock them up in a room for a couple hours, and once I'd schooled them on how story works, I asked them to come up with a prototype of how this could work. And what we had was this out of context to all of you. It makes no sense at all, and that's okay. But imagine presenting a prototype like this to a CEO or an executive or a stakeholder or your boss, and having a story behind what is going on, and suddenly you're like Don Draper, and it's magical. And so this is how we ended up getting the CEO to buy into this idea of, okay, let's redesign, let's build. But that's still risky, and selling a story is only as powerful as the story you're actually going to build in the end. And so we then started to actually have to build this. And when we started realizing what this is something, we talk about, friction and making things easy to use, and let's make it simple and have fewer screens. And when we had identified the story, what we saw is that as we were prototyping, when we tried to make things more simple, the story would break. And as we were testing with real people, we'd bring them into our office once a week, we just started seeing people are always getting stuck, they're not moving forward. And so ultimately, on all the key flows with this product, we built more into it, but we moved the story forward. And we tested every step of the way to the point that when we actually launched the real product, we were able to measure and get data like we doubled engagement, got 10 times as many people using the product. And this was not just a stroke of luck. It was something that we meticulously monitored and prototyped and hypothesized and tested the entire time. So the idea here is what I want you to do when you go home tomorrow and go back to work and start thinking about the projects that you're working on is not thinking, what software am I going to use, what language, or using this or that, or what is my team comprised of, and these are all really important questions. But what I always want you to ask is first, what is the story? And then how do we support that story? How do we make that story real? So again, first and foremost, big question, always ask yourself, what is the story? And to do that, you have to ask, who is my hero? What is their big goal? And how are we going to help them move forward to meet that goal? There might be some sword fights and stuff in there, and again, that's okay. And most importantly, to build a story, you always want to ask yourself, how do we make things go boom? For anyone on the other end, our users, our customers, people internally, stakeholders, team. How do you make things go boom and possibly last forever and ever and go on and on and on? If you'd like to learn more, my new book, The User's Journey, is from Rosenfeld Media. It puts all of this in a nice, handy form so that you can start working on stories with your team on your next project. And thank you.